latest top tips, reviews and advice, please subscribe below.
Hello and welcome to Attwoolls Outdoors with me, Mike. Today I'm giving you almost a bit kind of tutorial video slash a bit more of an advice video. So with me today I'm talking about overcoming problems with your tent or awning, whether it be something like a manufacturing default or something that you've accidentally done yourself. It's always worth learning about the tricks of the trades or how to get across problems. And to a certain extent throughout this video we'll talk about individual problems, show you how to rectify them, and also find problems that actually aren't problems. So there may be some things that are, the way the tent is built is actually how it is, and a lot of people do kind of actually misconceive things of being a physical, maybe a patch or a repair or something like that, that's actually down to DNA how the tent is actually made. So we'll kind of go through that initially. A couple of things to mention beforehand is if you generally do have any problems with your products, you're best off going back to the place you bought it from. Your warranty tends to be with them, and they'll often liaise with kind of the brand or the manufacturer of said product to get it resolved. It's almost worth having your kind of receipt to hand, so that way it's much easier in terms of the process depending on who you kind of deal with. The thing in terms of about tents and awnings, certainly for the UK market, is literally everything is made by hand. So whether it be a massive tent, a small tent, everything is handmade through every single process. So things like the material being cut is all handmade, being stitched together. It's done by handmade through machines. In terms of the actual heat sealing the seams, it's done by hand. Packing away, quality control, all these things are controlled by hands. So it means that there's more people involved, more chance for human error to kind of slip into it. And arguably one thing I would also say is that the more kind of features and more kind of high-end tents, in theory, have got a higher probability of having an issue, just because the more things there is to put on a tent, the more problems there can be. So that's where, in terms of the physical process of putting it together, often it tends to be the same, depending on whether a brand uses their low-end stuff or their high-end stuff, because the concept of how it's put together is the same itself, from stitching it together, weaving it, stitching it. So it's really about scalability. So actually, if you've got two things to do, you're less likely to make an issue of those in comparison to doing 100 things to do. So it's always a worthwhile consideration. But other things I would mention is problems that we see that, like I said, aren't necessarily problems. So first one we'll kind of tick off the list is a very common issue we do get queried about. A lot of people believe there's sort of a patch located on the bottom of the tent. Now, this isn't the case. What this essentially is down to the manufacturing process to put lugs in the middle of ground sheets, whether it be a lug for kind of the bedroom section to hold it in place, or for an additional bedroom in the center there. What you have to do is physically stitch it onto the ground sheet and then weld a patch at the top. Once the patch has been welded over, often we see it tape seamed around the outside. So this is kind of clear sort of marking of how it looks, and as you can see from this video, it looks something like this to a certain extent. So probably the most common issue we tend to find with tents, certainly in the polyester range, is that they suffer terribly from condensation. Now, condensation is often kind of actually misdiagnosed as leaking. Now, there's a clear difference between kind of condensation and leaking. It's a bigger problem now, certainly because we've kind of have more tents with sealed in ground sheets and less ventilation in a tent. So we've done a separate kind of condensation video for that, which kind of talks a bit more about that. But right now we're talking about why it happens, or how to notify it. So if you've kind of got water coming in everywhere, that's going to be condensation. The material itself is extremely waterproof, and it's highly unlikely it's going to come through there. Where it's going to come through is obviously where it joins together, i.e. a seam. All the seams actually kind of essentially got heat sealed taping on them. So again, that's designed to keep the water out. Now, if you're going to get a problem, it tends to be an isolated problem in one single location. Again, it's not also to be sort of misjudged with condensation dripping from a hanging point coming down. Now, if there's a physical issue with the tape seaming, then possibly, yeah, that could be the case. But often condensation will actually try and drip down for its lowest point to find the gravity. When we look for a seam here, often you can actually see a little bit of kind of clear taping either side of the seam, and that's kind of obviously heat welded on when it's manufactured. And as we talked about in the start of this video, everything's done by hand. So there's always the chance that there's going to be an issue at some point along the line. From a fixing point of view, Often manufacturers will sometimes supply seam sealant, which allows you just to kind of give yourself a bit of a waterproof coating on the side. It's something we've done for the best part of 20 odd years. Admittedly, some manufacturers don't actually give you that seam sealant anymore, but if you speak to kind of a lot of the retailers like ourselves, we'll often happily give that to you if it solves the issue. And sometimes it's a much simpler process doing that because A, you know the rest of the tent's perfectly fine. You don't want to send something back for one issue and come back and find it's got another. And we've got an inherent time of problems seem to find customers and it just repeats, and you get other people who haven't got any problems at all. And in terms of applying on, we've again got a separate video about seam sealing it, and all you've got essentially is kind of, it's almost like a glue. You just put it over the top, allow it to dry, it sets, it gives it a watertight seal, and then from that point you don't really have any issue. It doesn't really aesthetically look any different, and it's exactly the same, and it wouldn't essentially void your warranty. So it's a very quick and easy solution, and again, you'll only really see that if there's a problem with how it's been manufactured together. So that gives you a bit more idea about, certainly from a condensation point of view, touching on it a little bit, but also from sort of the seams and how it's actually kind of, well, it's sort of gripped together and then obviously coated to the top. It's worth also mentioning that actually you don't see it in polycotton tents because you don't necessarily have tape seaming because it's naturally waterproof in terms of the way it's done. So it's only really polyester tents that you will see this point, and even if there's daylight coming through, that's still not a bad thing. Essentially, as long as it's taped, that's perfectly fine. So it is perfectly normal to see kind of daylight through the stitching. So that's also a little point to be aware of. There are obviously multiple things to be aware of when it comes to inflatable tents as well. So not only do we have kind of the concept of the tube and sort of sleeve system, similar to a kind of bike tire, but also the manual pump. So here's a few things to bear in mind. First thing, we'll start with the pump itself. Often pumps will have a physical pressure gauge in place. The pressure gauge doesn't always necessarily give a reading while you're pumping, sort of using it sort of statically. So the reason being is some actual valve systems, mostly called Boston valves, have a seal behind them. So it's only as air is physically going through it that will actually give a bit of backward pressure and give a reading. So often you find actually the dial goes up and down. The true way to test if your pressure gauge is necessarily working is to put your thumb directly over it and do a very slow downward pump while looking at the gauge. What you find is that actually, to be fair, it will actually flick up and hold itself in position, and that way is a better way to tell if whether the gauge itself is working. What you find is actually sometimes the gauges itself aren't screwed in properly, so depending on the make or manufacturer, you can actually unscrew it and re-screw it back in, make sure the thread's okay, but also make sure it's tightened enough that it's not escaping any air out of there. Another thing to also be aware of as when it comes to pumps is often you need to make sure the pressure gauge is on the inflate part of the actual pump itself rather than the deflate. Again, because there's almost like a one-way system, by having it on deflate, it's stopping any air going into the actual pump itself. So you'll often find that the pump just jams or won't allow you to physically use it. And that's because the pressure gauge, again, is on the deflate, not on the inflate. Valves vary in terms of actual sort of models. Often you find there'll be tends to be three main options, and I'll kind of use a generic term. So we've got kind of Vango's airspeed valve, which is a special valve unique to them. That's got the idea that essentially what you do is, a lot of people struggle with actually keeping it on open. You got to make sure you basically push the kind of spring in, rotate it, so the sort of nib on the end is sort of facing horizontally and stays on open. You should see the spring is actually fairly kind of remains pressed in, and that's a clear identification that it's literally open. All the valves tend to have little caps on them as well, to make sure it almost acts as a bit of a double seal. Whereas something like a kind of Boston valve, which probably arguably is most common, looks something like this. There's kind of two parts to the valve, and again, from an inflation point of view, you've got a little cap at the front, which you need to make sure that is on after you finish pumping. Again, this acts as a second seal. Saying that, the kind of the part located behind it is the threaded part, so you necessarily use that to deflate it, and that's where that little part is. Often they'll have little rubbers around there. Again, that's going to help to make sure it's nicely sealed. And then finally, the last kind of valve you'll see is what I call more of a typical kind of dinghy valve. So it looks like this. It's got a big kind of button which you kind of press in and out. Now what you find with this valve, you can find that the air may possibly leak if it's not essentially tightened. So you almost think of it as like a nut and bolt kind of scenario. And essentially you want to make sure it's obviously tightened enough. Now you can either do that necessarily with a pair of pliers, but some manufacturers also kind of supply a tool. So you can quite neatly pop that in and give it a rotation clockwise, obviously, to tighten it, or anti-clockwise to sort of loosen it off. So that's also a maintenance thing that is almost worth being aware of to make sure that's tight enough. Otherwise, you might get a little bit of air seal through. Pretty much all the other valves on the market already kind of have the valve part pre-welded in. So if you tend to get a kind of a little bit of a leak coming out of the tube itself, it's most likely going to be either from the weld around the actual part itself. Always make sure that you want to make sure it's nice and tight. Certainly with the Boston valves, it's very common for things to be cross-threaded, and especially with the plastic, you want to give it a little bit of a countersink before properly tightening it up, and it makes sure it's fully tight. And you can always put your ear to it if it's kind of necessarily in the tent itself. The other place where we find that possibly there may be an issue is the weld on the bottom. Now, the joys of having kind of your own repair kit on hand is absolutely imperative, really, because what it allows you to do is actually, you know, use things like the seam sealer glue to actually cover it over, or a self-adhesive patch. Often brands will actually include kind of a tenacious tape kind of style, so there's a clear plastic adhesive tape that you can put on anything like this, be it material or even the actual tube itself. When it comes to weld, really you want to look towards to use a glue, and again it's simply you can just kind of pop it on there or a bit of excess material and fold it over. This is why it's always a good idea, if need be, is to carry a spare tube with you. Now, most brands do sand them additionally, and it's kind of the concept of a spare tyre in a car or in a bike. You have it in a bladder, you can replace that quite nice and easily. The casing tends to be kind of fairly, you know, in there, and often you tend to find that's reusable. But if it's kind of a bladder, it can be a slow leak, which typically tends to be either kind of a valve issue or a very small hole. But it's not very often you find that. Normally tends to be a weld, and you can kind of hear it. But often, if it's, like I said, a very slow leak, it tends to be more of a valve problem. The sleeve itself is also worth a look, because sometimes what you find is essentially if the zip is apart for any reason, that's when potentially you will get a little bit of a problem. All it essentially needs to do is sometimes the zip needs to go back down to the bottom and re-zip itself back up, and that way it keeps it all in. The bladder itself is designed to kind of expand and keep going. The sleeve itself keeps its shape and rigidity. So really that's imperative that like I said, is really nice and zipped up. And often you need to make sure that it's actually cable tied to stop the zip parting and then the actual tube itself from expanding outside of it. One thing with most tents is one tube tends to be the same throughout the whole length. And if a tube, for example, is a little bit longer, it's not the end of the world. You can quite nice and easily fold it over. Most tents will have, like I said, a designated tube located to it, and some will have several. For me, I would recommend kind of going a little bit longer, and you can always fold it over. And what in this scenario here, say you had an issue with the front tube, because the middle ones are exactly the same, you can relocate the middle to the front. That will kind of keep you going for a little bit. You know, it might even get you past your sort of your extra few days or week you've got to go there, or at least allows you to work on the actual tent itself, either replace or repair the bladder while leaving the tent in place. You're not suddenly then everything else has got to come out of it inside. So there's these little things you can sort of swap it around. We've done kind of a separate video review of kind of replacing a sleeve and bladder and move it back into place as well as a little error view about essentially the beam's twisted or it's kind of bulging out. So you can always look at that as a bit of a reference, but that's not to say that, you know, air is really good concept, and then even its poled has its own kind of issues, as we'll see now. Pole tents aren't without their own problems as well. So what we find with pole tents, traditionally, there either tends to be kind of, it tends to sort of shatter or splinter down the end. It's actually a design feature of the fiberglass, and it's when it's put under essentially too much stress. The joys of this actually is in its design is you can just tape it up and kind of make do for your kind of time away, or failing that, just replace that individual section. Now, the sections are fairly universal, it depends on the diameter itself, but you can basically pick and choose a right diameter and then cut it down to the correct length. And again, as always, we've got our own kind of little video showing you how you restring it, but as a concept, it's quite simple. What you find is actually you have a fiberglass pole like this. It's not a bad thing to actually carry it as a spare part, just because it finds that it's better to have it on the campsite and use it as you wanted to, and you can really simply just re-thread it. All you actually have running through it is kind of this kind of cord scenario. So it's elasticated cord, and what you can literally do is just re-thread it through. So there's a hole directly down it, feed that directly through itself, and as it kind of goes through the actual pole, you'll come out the other side. And all that stops it from being pulled back out is when you turn it upside down, is to tie a knot in the top end. So what you find is that as long as the knot's big enough or bigger than the hole itself, you can keep pulling and pulling to your heart's content, and it's not going to come out. So that's kind of how you, in a short way, kind of re-thread the pole. This is important because when you essentially get your tent, what sometimes you can find is actually the cord may have snapped in between. It's not so much the cord snapped, but if you imagine the poles are kind of all zigzagged in a big bunch as they are, and you've got a metal ferrule. If, for example, for any reason that pole is dropped on its end, it's going to start to make little indents into the actual kind of elasticated cord, and eventually when it comes to tension, it's often to snap. It's not the end of the world. All it just needs to do is re-thread it using that sort of process, and like I said, we've got a separate process on how it does, needs to do. Fiberglass is sort of fairly inexpensive, and it's not really designed, to be kind of overly too strong, because it's more about making it more cost effective than, to be perfectly honest. It's not like the same as sort of steel. One thing worth mentioning is actually most manufacturers don't actually cover poles under their warranty when it comes to kind of fiberglass poles. And to be fair, to a certain extent, steel, because typically if there tends to be damage, more often than not, it comes down to sort of storm weather or occasionally misuse. So but for the small extra costs, it's always worth having a spare pack as well, just by working out what diameter you need. And to a certain extent, most poles tend to be the same length, so you can just cut them down once you've got sorted. But if you've got the set, you can quite happily use it. Another very common issue is we find, actually, to be fair, is that with mesh, the mesh kind of keeps itself kind of woven together. So initially it looks like the material itself actually is kind of scagged, and you see a very kind of long sort of thin strip in it. It looks like it does look like it's kind of ripped apart a little bit. This is very common, and all it really is just the mesh is almost stuck to one another. So the way to kind of get around this is to actually just kind of get your nail onto it and give it a really kind of good scrape. Now you want to go almost kind of up from down, and you can always go from the inside as well, and almost sort of round circle. Really, you're just trying to break that mesh apart, and often you will find after you do that, it sits in its more natural form. So it often can be kind of confused, the fact that it's sort of damaged in a way, and just by doing that, it kind of resets it back to how you'd expect mesh to be. Another common question we really do get is, how do you get the creases out of your windows? Now, really, there's no kind of actual kind of art to this, to be fair. The longer the tent is actually up, the creases will eventually kind of fall out. Essentially, if the material itself gets warm, it tends to work a bit quicker, and I know people have gone to the extent of almost using like a hairdryer effect to drop them out. The reason we find kind of creases becoming more of a problem nowadays is because they took out a very harmful chemical out of the windows to make it a bit more eco-friendly. And that was a result in the kind of windows being a little bit more creased to start with. So it's something that kind of bear with, it will essentially fall out, but it's essentially better for the environment that we've now moved to kind of these more crinkly windows to a certain extent. Another common problem we come across really is kind of zips. Often we find that actually they can almost be out of line, so there is a process you can to kind of realign them. When, for example, a zip, even though they're very kind of strong, occasionally, for example, behind the puller or the runner, they can actually kind of split. I'm going to use this bag as a bit of an example. So when they sort of split, obviously it looks something like this, and when the zip still carries on and does up as you see, but as you pull behind it, it comes away. Now, all you can really do is take it all the way back to the start and bring it forward again, and what you find, it should realign itself and be fine. And then actually from there, it's still very strong. Doesn't really affect it in any sort of way. It's just the fact, for some reason, a tooth didn't necessarily kind of intertwine as it should have done. Now, if we come to the scenario when we take that zip all the way back, and essentially then you've got one side that's uneven from another, now we need to go through a relining process. So all we can do is be quite physical with it. We can kind of pull it back on itself and try and get it kind of even on either side. Now, bring it forward, it will still kind of zip pull all the way through, but take it all the way back again, and then really make sure it's right at the end before realigning it, and then it should look nice and neatly. So it's admittedly one thing with zips, you have to be kind of fairly forceful with them. They're very strong. The teeth on kind of whether it be a spiral chain zip or kind of more bloated, molded tooth zip, necessarily can take quite a bit of manipulation. And like I said, don't be worried about being a little bit too kind of harsh on it, to be fair. I think from us, we get to play with these zips an awful lot. We kind of get used to how kind of physical you can be, and you can put a lot of effort into it. It's not too often you can kind of damage them, but it's always one of the things that you can, again, a little trick you can do at home, whether it be on the actual kind of tent bag, like I've got here, the physical doors, and that's kind of a bit more of an idea about how to kind of play with the zips. Another problem we come across is actually zips not being able to physically do up. Now, this is either down to physically the actual strain on the zip, or the tent itself being out of shape. Often you want to make sure that all the doors are actually closed when you come to pitch the tent, because you can find actually it strains itself a bit too far away. For me, it's crucial that you also make sure that you physically lift the material up towards the zip, so that means it's going to glide a lot easier. I also do like to put my kind of sort of finger directly through the zip, just like so. It means you can actually, as you kind of bring the area around, have your finger out just to kind of increase that kind of smoothness and stop anything getting trapped directly in. So that's always a common problem, is that you find actually the zip starts to pull into this extra kind of baffle on the front of it. Now, by keeping your finger in place and bringing that round, it stops anything going directly into there as well. Often it could be quite common that if you've got, say, for a corner, you might always need to kind of like lift the fabric up into place just to kind of pull it a bit closer. So don't be kind of alarmed if you've got to distort the material itself to kind of get the zip directly through. It's just because there's either something in terms of the pitching that is very tight, but once you'll find that you give it a little bit of a helping hand and zip it up, it's perfectly fine. It's just down to kind of the tolerances of the actual part itself. But as I said, by taking kind of care with it, you can really make sure that it gets a really nice glide, and then you have less problems, and obviously less problems going further on down the line. So that is kind of our little sort of overview on little problems that you may or may not come across in your time. And it's one of those things that I think for anything, it's better to kind of have a repair kit to hand, or like spare tubes or spare poles. That way, if you do incur a kind of a problem on the campsite, obviously you can necessarily fix it. I would always stress, really importantly, how important it is to pitch your tent before you go away. Whether you've got it from the first time in a box, or failing that when you're actually away and you've left it in storage for a while, you always want to check your accommodation, which essentially is this, is up to scratch, and it's actually how you remember it being. Often we find that we have a problem at the end of the trip, think, oh, we'll deal with that later date, and completely forget about it. So that's where it's always a great idea to get it out, make sure it's not damp, make sure the mice hasn't kind of had a feast on it, and it's all where it should be, all components included. So by all means, if you have more questions or queries about anything you've seen in the video, you're welcome to check the link below this video to our website, where we've got more information on sort of pack size, general kind of spec and overcoming little bits and bobs. We've also got separate videos on our YouTube channel relating to a lot of stuff, from condensation to sorting out beam issues to replacing beams, replacing poles. So there's a whole kind of back catalogue of stuff you can check out to kind of get a bit more of an in-depth into kind of solving your issue. But thank you for watching. By all means, let us know if you in the comments box below if there's anything you'd love us to do in terms of from pitching, packing, reviews. It's always great to have good feedback from you. So thanks, and we'll hopefully see you again soon.